It's time again for The Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.
Hi, I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader.
And I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
We're the Insiders. So, Scott, what does the Trump conviction do to undecided voters here in Wisconsin? How does this affect them?
Well, I think that in general, Republicans have made up their mind about the president, and Democrats have made up their mind about President Trump. And the results were not unexpected for either of those teams. With regards to, I think there's two sets of voters that this matters. One is independents and the double haters, the folks who don't like either candidate. That it probably was somewhat damaging to the president, at least in the near term. But I think that there's also this question of whether or not it lasts, or whether, and people begin to just get used to the fact that every few weeks there's another trial and President Trump has been convicted of something that a district attorney of the opposite political persuasion has come up with in their county, whether it's New York or Georgia or wherever. What's happening is that the Democrats are doing their best here, or these Democrat Ds are doing their best to essentially disqualify the President Trump in the minds of independent voters. And they may be able to do that with some folks. The question is, do the issues that Trump is winning with those incumbents at the moment, like inflation and immigration, does that outweigh these convictions? Or are the convictions more powerful than those particular issues? I think it's going to probably break out in different ways with different sets of voters. The one group of voters who I think this is going to actually help Trump with is these inconsistent working class conservative voters. These folks who are new to the Trump team, they don't always vote because they got 2-3 jobs, they're busy, they think the system is rigged. But they like Trump. A lot of people who like Trump don't vote, which is a problem for the president. But if this energizes those people, that does help him in this case. And you've seen some examples, signs of that. I mean, there are people who are throwing, $20 and $30 at this guy to help with the legal costs, or, because they're angry about this whole thing. And those are those kind of voters, lower income folks who think this is not fair. But I think overall, with independent voters, it's going to be a question of what's more powerful, the issues or the stink of these convictions.
Well, I don't disagree that much with Scott. I think that the idea that it energizes some people who may not be regular voters, I think that falls away even more quickly than whether or not this issue is outstanding from. But I have seen some people who say this is kind of the disqualifying thing. It's not exactly shooting someone on 6th Avenue, but it is a pretty substantial matter. I think that it certainly, I think most Democrats would agree that it would have been far better had we had the January 6th issue decided. And we're clearly not going to get those things. Among other reasons is that there's actually a judge who's clearly in the bag for Trump, just like the Trumpians like to talk about, well, this is Bragg who is associated with Biden, even though Bragg was totally independent of Biden. But I would say this, I think that there will be some impact. And I think the only thing that I would mention that's a little different than where Scott is, it's kind of like, well, will this dissipate? I think the Democrats have a pretty easy way of addressing that by coming back with ads. And by the way that they can target now individually to voters, they know who are the undecideds usually in these races, and they'll be able to target them very directly with either a direct mail piece or even something digitally. And I think that will make somewhat of a difference. And even if that difference is less than 1%, if it's 0.75%, this race could be tight enough where that may make a difference. So I'll have some difference. Here's the other thing. I think that the suburban voters, which are kind of gradually going over to the Democratic side, or not that we're going to win, for example, the WOW counties around Milwaukee.
Right.
But what's happening is that they are gradually moving away from the Republicans. And I think this is kind of another nail in that Republican coffin. It looks to be, this guy just isn't qualified for the job. It is, as Scott says, the Democrats trying to disqualify him, and I think it helps put a nail in that coffin. But the final thing that I would go back to, and Scott and I always talk about this, but I think we should never have one of these segments without mentioning it, is that people vote emotionally. And how much is this the emotional issue that will drag people over the finish line? Um, it is kitchen table issues, and certainly where costs are in the grocery store is important. But is this that issue? And I will go back again to the thing that you've heard me say before. I think the abortion issue and reproductive rights and mifepristone and all those things. We have a decision coming down from the U.S. Supreme Court. These are all things that I think probably will have a greater impact at the end of the day than some of the other things that are the bigger issues that some people look at.
I think you're right that the story's not over, right? First of all, the convictions in New York could be overturned by another court very easily before the election. That's entirely possible. Whether or not the president goes to jail or if he is freed by another judge, right? Or someone throws out the jury instructions. All those things are possible before the election. And yet there's 2 or 3 more of these cases stacked up at different places. They could go in different ways. And you have a U.S. Supreme Court that's taking a look at some of the questions around January 6th and presidential immunity. And the decision they make could also make this more confusing for the public, or it could just be a cloud of dust, and people just read it however they wanted to read it in the first place, because there'll be so many different legal decisions from different angles.
And I think that that's a really good point that Scott makes. Decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court here, and there are a couple, and this is the season when these things come out. For those of you who don't know, the court generally kind of ends its action in May and then issues final decisions in June. And that's usually the end of the court season until they get back in the fall, except for maybe something special that comes through that they have to make a quick decision on. And there are some issues in front of them that could have that emotional impact on voters. But as Scott says, there's a lot of water to go under the bridge before this November.
The conclusion, stay tuned.
You've been listening to The Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.